Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of CMA Sessions. My name is Jacelyn Arradaza with the South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs. Today, we'll be talking about Asian American identity and the issues surrounding it. Our guest is a South Asian activist and the Director of Advocacy and Policy for Food Share South Carolina. She is very active in the AAPI community as she worked for the South Asian American Digital Archives and has written several articles about South Asian culture, injustices, and discrimination. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Omme-Salma. Hey, Omi, I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today. How's it going?
Thanks, Harrington. I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Well, just to get started here, Omi, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I was actually born in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, which is in East Africa, but I am of South Asian ancestry. So there's a long history there of migration and trade between South Asia and East Africa. They share an ocean, the Indian Ocean, and our transportation routes back in the day in the 1800s were definitely maritime. So there's a long history there, and so there's a sizable population of South Asians in East Africa. So that's kind of my heritage background. But I grew up in Canada, actually, and I just moved to South Carolina about 5 years ago. And I currently work as the Director of Advocacy and Policy at Food Share, which is a food access organization in South Carolina.
Well, you mentioned you grew up in Canada. As a South Asian woman, did you struggle with being both Asian and Canadian and I guess now American?
I mean, what a mix of identities, right? Because I am also East African, I'm South Asian, I'm Canadian, I'm American. And yeah, it's always been a struggle. So much so, like the identity part, right? So much so that it led me to a PhD, which I didn't finish. Try to think through these questions of identity, right? I think in Canada and certainly in the States to a different extent, we already have a definition of what a South Asian should be or what an Indian should be, what it means to be Chinese, what it means to be, whatever, Korean, South Korean. And then when you were someone like me, and I think everyone, even if you are South Asian, don't fit into that description or to that mold, it's really hard to kind of find yourself as a South Asian American within those within those communities. Because here, I think in America, what South Asian tends to mean is upper caste Hindus from India, right? And that's clearly not what I am. I'm Muslim, I'm Shia, I'm from East Africa, so there's all this diversity in identity within the South Asian community, within the South Asian American community, that I think on the larger scale and within the non-South Asian community is not really recognized. I think it's easy, when we think of non-white identities within the state, to easily codify them, to easily identify them, to kind of white sensibilities or white understandings of history. And when you don't fit in that really kind of pits you against the nation and, their expectation and understanding of, we've all heard of the term model minority, right? So if you don't fit within that terminology of model minority, the state, the nation doesn't know what to do with you.
I 100% agree. And I'm so sorry that I know I've done some research about it. A lot of South Asians, they don't feel like they're really Asian. So I'm glad you touched on that. Because can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I want to kind of know where's this disconnect coming from?
Well, it's not that we don't think of ourselves as Asian. Like, I totally identify as South Asian, but there's a particular understanding of what that means already. Without getting to know me, you're like, oh, not you in particular, but society thinks, oh, you watch Bollywood movies, you speak Hindi, you eat Indian food, right? There's already this understanding, like you do yoga. There's kind of already this understanding of what it means to be like a brown Asian, to be South Asian, is to be Indian, is to be Hindu, right? So it's not that I don't identify, I completely identify as South Asian. I just don't identify as Indian. which is, I think, where there's a disconnect, right? Because there's like an understanding, like India just takes up so much space in the popular imagination, right? And it's easy, like, for whiteness, for white supremacy to function, you have to know the other, right? You have to understand who they are in order to control them. That's the way colonialism works, right? So you've created this category of South Asian. This is what it means. And if you don't fall within that, it causes that disconnect. So I very much do identify as South Asian. I identify as East African as well, which I know is confusing to folks, right? But that's my history. That's my identity. And so, instead of already putting people into these categories of understanding, if we listen to their story, if we heard their stories, if we try to understand, the complexity of colonialism history. Like, the reason I'm East African is completely part of the British Empire building project, right? And why I ended up in Canada, from East Africa. So when we think about identity outside of history, I think that's where we get a problem.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Something I wanted to mention, I remember growing up and in second grade, my close friend at the time, he's Korean, he would bring Korean dishes to lunch. And I would watch him eat like mandu, which is a Korean dumpling. And every time he would eat it, he would cover his mouth. And at the time, I thought, oh, he's just being polite, doesn't want anyone to see that he's eating. But looking back, I realize now he did it because people would constantly question him about the smell of his food. And he was embarrassed. So he conditioned himself to cover his mouth so that the smell wouldn't escape. Were you ever embarrassed of your culture similar to how he was?
I mean, sure. I think that's a common kind of feeling of people my age. I wonder what it's like now. Like, I'm in my mid 40s. So when I was young, going to school, bringing lunches, that was the mid 80s or the late 80s, right? So our communities looked different then. I grew up in Toronto, unlike South Carolina. Toronto is very diverse in terms of racial mixture, right? Here we're in a 50-50 state. And that's very different than the kind of place I grew up in, right? I grew up in a community in downtown Toronto that had a lot of people from my community, right? There was a lot of South Asian, East Africans where I grew up. I grew up in, what we would call an ethnic enclave. So I went to school with a lot of people that looked like me, that had the same history as me, because we, grew up in these apartment buildings, right? Like in what, we would term the inner city or an ethnic ghetto. That's where I grew up. So I didn't have any white friends. I always tell the story. I didn't have any white friends. I was in college, so there wasn't that level of shame and embarrassment. And I know, for example, my nephews, I looked at their class pictures, and out of like 20 kids, I'm not kidding, there's like 4 white kids, right? So again, like, I think in a place like South Carolina, that might be, or in other smaller cities, that might be the experience that young kids of color grew up with. But I can't exactly remember. Like, I know that lunchroom situation. I've read about it so much, right, when I was doing my studies. But I don't think it ever happened to me. Even like wearing like salwar kameezes, which are like traditional South Asian clothes. I can't think of a time, I'll be honest, where I was embarrassed. I might, like, I don't even, like, I know this was one of the questions, and I'm trying to kind of think about it because I don't want to devalue that experience, right? That happens to a lot of kids of color, but I can't say that it particularly happened to me. I'm not sure that my nephews experienced that, and they're South Asian mixed as well. Like, they're East African, obviously their mom's East African and their dad's Tamil, and they go to a school with only kids of color, so I wonder if there's kind of shaming between the ethnicities. I can't imagine that's a thing. Like, this school celebrates Eid and has an Eid Mela, and like it's, things that I wish that I had when I was a kid. Because certainly when it was our holidays or when it was Eid, our parents would take us out of school, and that's something that wasn't embarrassing, but I guess it was different. Like, we would be celebrating our holidays, and that, it wasn't Christmas, and weird things like having to like sing Christmas carols and do Christmas pageants. That was kind of strange, but I don't think there was like a mockery. I think, the mockery came just out of other stuff, like, not being cool or whatever. But I don't know if that was racially coded. I mean, I'm sure it was. I'd have to think about it deeper, but like kind of on the surface. No, I was never made fun of for my ethnic food or clothes or anything like that.
Well, you were very fortunate to be growing up in a pretty diverse town. Because growing up in South Carolinian school system, we're not really taught any AAPI history. A lot of the curriculum that does include AAPI countries kind of paints us as like outsiders. For example, we only hear about China, Vietnam, Korea when we talk about their political background, and Japan to talk about World War II. And there's a lot of debate if the education system is the cause for rising racism in the AAPI community. So since you grew up in such a diverse town and city, were there a lot of representation, and did representation in schools, media, government affect you in a positive or negative way growing up?
So definitely when I was growing up, there was no history taught. And I'm not sure that even now I think it is. I mean, again, like it's really hard to like, this is my experience, which was like 30 years ago compared to what's going on now, because I know things have shifted. I know things have changed, right? For example, certainly not in South Carolina, but in Toronto, like I was saying, my nephews, the schools understand what Eid is, and they get Eid off. And that's because a lot of the teachers are teachers of color. And that's really important, right? For there to be representation of our histories, of Asian histories and Asian struggles and Asian culture, we really do need educators that are Asian. Like that is fundamental. We need a diversity of educators. And I mean, we have such a crisis of education in the state. But I think and I'm not saying that Toronto's perfect. Do not get me wrong. I mean, there is a lot of racism that still happens. There's a lot of Islamophobia in Canada. It is not, it is not a place devoid of that. But I think in the education system, there is an effort to include that history. I don't know here, but I know May is Asian History Month. I think that's the same here. So I really think that we need educators to make sure that history is taught, and we need the tools, to make sure that that's taught. And I'm going to do a selfish plug if you give me 1 second. So speaking about needing the tools, there's, for example, this great book called Our Stories, an Introduction to South Asian America. And it's basically a textbook, right? Like it's a textbook of South Asian history in the States. So you had mentioned that I was a part of the South Asian American Digital Archive. I was a fellow there. And what that organization does is try to document the diversity of South Asian history in America. And so I was a fellow documenting the oral histories of Ugandan Asian refugees here in South Carolina. So there's a history of, in Uganda and East Africa, like I mentioned, there's a big South Asian community. And in 1972, in Uganda, they were exiled by a fascist dictator government, Idi Amin. And so they had to be resettled all over the world. Most of them went to the UK because of that colonial British history. A big portion went to Canada, but a very, very small number of refugees came here to the United States, and 500 settled in upstate South Carolina. That's our history. That's our Asian history right here in South Carolina. And I'm sure a lot of people don't know about that, right? That is South Asian history. It was the first refugee resettlement project. We know now that we have lots of Afghan refugees. We have Ukrainian refugees coming. We have a really large population of Congolese refugees in South Carolina, but it all kind of refugee resettlement started with the South Asian resettlement project. So these are the kinds of stories that are told in this book. And these are the kinds of books that we need in our libraries and in our universities and in our grade schools, right? In our high schools. This is very accessible kind of book, and it tells that kind of history. So yeah, growing up, we didn't see that, but it's changing now. And we do see that through efforts like this and through kind of like a diversity of our educators.
Well, thank you for sharing that. So one thing that I really struggled with coming to terms with my ethnic and cultural identity as a Filipino American, because I grew up in Duncan, South Carolina, there was only 2 Filipinos in my class of 600, including me. So I didn't really find or come to terms with it until I joined the Filipino American Student Association here at the University of South Carolina. The Filipino American Student Association, also known as FASA, is an inclusive student-led club centered around Filipino culture and identity. So because I grew up in a small town where I wasn't around my culture, and because I grew up in a mixed household, I didn't get to learn much about where I came from or about Filipino culture, like learning the language. I know a little bit about food, but other than that, I was kind of lost. FAFSA allowed me to be surrounded by people who are not only struggling with the same issues as me, but also establish relationships with people who have figured out how to embrace the culture. And without this, I don't think I would be as proud of my roots as I am today. So was there experience or something similar that helped you become comfortable with your cultural identity?
So like I said, I grew up in a like, I didn't know it. I don't know how to phrase it. It's like I grew up in an ethnic ghetto with, I hate that word, but I grew up in a community that was predominantly people similar to me. In our apartment complex, we weren't majority in the apartment complex, but there was enough of us. Like my grandparents both lived there. I had tons of friends that, lived in that apartment complex, and we went to the same mosque. We all went to the same school. And it was only when we moved to the suburbs and I started high school that, I left that community and really discovered other South Asians. To me, that's the funny thing, like I never knew, for example, that East African Asians, sorry, there's a plane going by, that like I never knew that South Asian East Africans were doctors or engineers. Like we grew up in, a really kind of immigrant neighborhood. We were, low income or working class or like low middle income. So those were the type of things that I was discovering when I left that community and we moved to the suburbs. A lot of, it came to a time where a lot of people in that community were buying houses in the suburbs. And what was interesting for me was to discover other South Asians, right? I grew up we moved to a suburb in the high school that had a lot of South Asians, and they were Pakistani, they were Indians, there were Bangladeshis, Sri Lankan Tamils. And, so that was for me was, almost a discovery of what it was to be South Asian, like a proper Indian. Like, that's the first time I watched a Bollywood movie. Not that I didn't know what Bollywood was. It was just not something that I was interested in. But I kind of felt like, oh, I should really be South Asian in this way, in the way that's kind of coded of understanding in America and, in Canada, and who I'm surrounded by. So that moment was a bit flipped. Ironically, is that, I was getting in touch with an identity that I thought I should get in touch with because it's my ancestry, right? So I guess it's almost similar to that. And that was through meeting other South Asians, other South Asians of diverse backgrounds, right? And I remember like just, a funny story I'll tell you about like these cultural groups, right? Because in the suburb where I grew up, there was a lot of diversity. We used to have culture, what was it called? Like the multicultural show, where there was like a talent show, but it was like, different cultures. So like, the Indians would do a Bollywood dance, and the Trinidadians would do a chutney dance, and, the Black Caribbeans would do a different kind of dance. Filipinos would do a different kind of dance. There was, really segmented into your cultural groups, right? So ninth grade, the beginning of high school, and I was like, I want to do this. This is the cool thing to do, which is also, really interesting. Like multicultural shows, the cool thing to do in Mississauga, a suburb of Toronto. And so I went to the meeting, and they're like, okay, so all the Chinese people over here, all the Filipinos over here, all the Indians over here, all the like Indo-Trinidadians over here, all the like Black Caribbeans over there. And I was like, where do I fit in? So I went to like the African side, because that's the culture I knew. Like I knew I was from Africa. I knew I was not from India. I knew I didn't understand Hindi and couldn't do a Bollywood dance necessarily. Like we had danced Bollywood, but in a different way, I think. So I was like, well, my identity is African, so I'm gonna go to the African side. And it was like me and this other Black woman, and we're like, we don't even share like a culture, even though we're from the same place. And so we kind of disbanded. And then I never participated in multicultural night. My sister did, ironically, my younger sister, and she participated in the Indo-Trinidadian like chutney kind of dance, I think, or maybe she did like the Caribbean hip hop dances, not hip hop, the Caribbean reggae or soca. So even she didn't feel like she should do the Bollywood dancing Indian group. So I mean, I think it's just as informative as your story of being part of the Filipino Association. But how do we find and unfind culture when we grow up and have access to these kinds of groups in more diverse places?
I like how you mentioned that multicultural kind of event because we have something similar. It's more Vietnamese related. It's called Culture Collision. And a lot of the students, they do a cultural Vietnamese dance, such as the fan dance or hats, or they'll even have the dragons, which is really, it's a fan favorite. But thank you for sharing that because I don't know, I think it's cool. It's nice to see that culture coming out, even in dance, where everyone's more excited, everyone's hype about it. So I think that's really fun. And I'm glad you shared that, even though you were a bit confused in that time. Still, at least it was good that they had that show.
Yeah.
So,
Totally. And that was like, in the late 90s or mid 90s, late 90s.
right. Yeah. I'm glad that y'all had that experience because I didn't have that experience until I came to college. In 2022, we've seen more AAPI communities become represented in all aspects. We see more media representation with the success of TV shows and movies like Squid Games, Shang-Chi, Raya, and we even had our first presidential candidate. Although this is a major success for AAPI communities, we see more East Asian and Southeast Asians represented than South Asians represented. So for our viewers watching, wondering the differences, East Asians are people from China, Hong Kong, Japan, Mongolia, both Koreas, and Taiwan. Southeast Asians are people from Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore. South Asians are people from Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and the Maldives. So after that, so seeing all the increasing representation with East Asians, Southeast Asians, how do you feel about the increasing representations of the AAPI populations in the media?
Well, our vice president is South Asian, right?
Right.
We can't forget she's half Indian. And I think like there's so much South Asian representation in the media. I mean, and in government. I think, who am I trying to think of? There's a lot of like presenters on CNN who are South Asian. A lot of people in the government who are South Asian. And Jayapal, Rokana, like really like for me, it's like really progressive. But we have like Republican South Asians whose politics I don't necessarily agree with. Obviously, here, oddly enough, in South Carolina, our governor was South Asian. Bobby Jindal, who is also from the South, which I think is really interesting that these Southern South Asians are represented in government in the Republican sphere. So like, I mean, I think it's great. I think that I think it's also great that the representation of South Asians, I don't know if it's great, but like they're Democrats and Republicans. Like I think even with East Asians, here we have in South Carolina, I'm trying to remember, he's a state representative from I want to say Chesterfield. He's East Asian, Representative Yao, for example, and he's a Republican, right? So I think this increasing representation is, is a good thing. But for me, and like Bell Hooks say, representation without reformation, or what's her quote? Representation without transformation, I don't think is useful, right? So sure, we have people who are of AAPI backgrounds, but are they acting in the interest of AAPI folks in America? Are they transforming the system so it's more equitable, and better in service of the whole community, right? The whole community and that we represent. So those are, that's really what I would like to see. I would like to see that representation come with some transformation. Um, just not repeating the discourses that are already there, but really thinking about new ways that we can service our communities, new ways that we can, change politics or change even the media or the types of shows that we're watching. And I think that that's happening, in TV shows. I'm watching this, like I think 10 years ago, AAPI shows were about being Asian, right? They were like the struggles of, blended identities and blended cultures. And I think we're past that conversation. I think that's a tired conversation. I don't think that's a true representation of like second, third generation Asians in this country, right? It's just absolutely not. And then you used to get those shows with the really terrible accents of the parents, making fun of the parents, and the kids would be so embarrassed. Like that's tired, that's cliched. That's not necessarily, I think, the experience of young AAPI folks in the country right now. I'm just watching this this show, I think it's on Netflix, called Boobage, and it's hilarious. And the lead actress is East Asian, and it's not her, it's not that trope of like, oh, I'm caught in the middle of Asian culture and American culture, right? It's just like, I'm East Asian, whatever. I live a life that is my life, and it is what it is. And it's such a funny show, and it allows, and that's, it allows us to take the conversation somewhere else, right? I can't say that the conversation is invigorating in the show or anything like that, but it allows us to be Asian, and it allows us to be Asian American without having to question it or to judge it or to interrogate it in that way. So I think, that's, I think that's a good thing. But and I wonder, like, I'd have to watch the show a bit more, just like super analyzing the show. But like, I hope there are conversations there that are happening that haven't happened in shows, for example. Like, what is that allowing for? I would hope to see that in that show and in other shows. So that's I guess my answer. I hope that makes sense.
No, that made sense. I think Marvel is coming out with a TV show that focuses on a South Asian or Southeast Asian. Yeah. And I'm pretty excited about that. Are you?
Yeah.
Do you think that they're going to carry it out well, hopefully?
I know nothing about Marvel. I know, I think I should, but I don't watch it at all. So I don't know the context. I don't know if it's a good representation that I have not read about that. But I know there's a lot of Muslims that are super excited about it. So, and think of it as a positive representation. So for now, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, hopefully once it comes out, hopefully it'll be a success, and they do it well. Yeah.
So and that's the thing. It's like Asian representation with Asian. We saw there was, like, in the new reboot of Sex and the City, which was absolutely terrible. The way that they represented people of color was just stupid, right? So you really need Asians in front of the camera and behind the camera for it to be a form of representation that is doing the community justice.
I 100% agree. I think there needs to be someone to, make sure it's accurate and not offensive in any way. Because a lot of people are just unaware of how these cultures kind of connect and interact with each other. So someone who is a part of that culture needs to be at least on the film or around that area, like looking at what's going on, making sure everything is accurate, not offensive, and doing justice for the community.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think there's such a thing as like an accurate representation, but it's a representation that, at least represents the, there's not one way to be
Right.
any type of Asian, but that it comes from, the creative mind of a person of color, of an Asian person.
Well, very inspiring words, Omme. I'm so glad we had this opportunity to have this conversation to talk about struggling with cultural identity and everything surrounding it. So thank you so much again for joining us. Before we let you go, are there any final words that you want to, just say at the end? Or also, what is the website, or how can people reach out to you?
Sure. Yeah. And if you put this in the show notes, but as I was saying, I was a fellow with the South Asian American Digital Archive, and I've written a lot about the Ugandan Asians here in South Carolina, which I think is such an important part of Asian history in our state. So I would love if people would read those articles. So I'll send them to you, and you can link them and have a website. But I'm on all the socials at Omme-SR. That's OMMESR. I hardly post anything, but please follow me and I'll follow you back, and we can be South Carolina friends. But I'll send you all of that so you can link it. But learn about the Asian history here in our state. It's really rich.
Again, thank you so much for joining us today, Omme. And thank you for everyone watching today. This was another episode of CMA Sessions, where we talked about struggling with finding and accepting our cultural identity. Be sure to check out our other CMA Sessions on our Facebook and our website, cma.sc.gov, and check out our Facebook and other social medias to keep up with what's going on at the Commission on Minority Affairs. Have a good day and see you next time. Thank you again, Omme.
Thank you.